G'day everyone and welcome to the shed. We're back working on the HG ute again, and in this episode we're going to do a heap of work to do with the structure that goes underneath the roof. Now this car wasn't overly rusty, but there was a lot of things that needed attention. So this panel is from another car. We get that ready to go in the car. We also replace this piece in under here and get that ready to weld in place. And we do a heap of repairs just in little areas where the rust is sat in here next to the roof turret skin and rusted into these corners. So we get that sorted out. We filmed a big episode and it wound up being way too long. So what we've done is split it into a couple of pieces, and the first part we're going to focus on getting everything ready, doing the minor repairs, give it all a sandblast and a prime, and in the next episode we'll get into the final fitting of these pieces inside and this new header bar in there, and we've got more footage on top of that when it comes to the back panel in there. So settle in and enjoy, and we'll get stuck straight into it. I've just been preparing this piece from a donor car to go into our HG ute. This one is one that I got from a friend of mine, and he'd had it for quite a number of years because he had restored one of these cars years ago, and this was one of his leftover pieces, so it just got thrown in the back of the shed. So it's gone a bit surface rusty, but there's no rot outs in it. This is all solid all the way across the front, whereas the one in our ute's got a rust out patch in here. And although very repairable, I've already done a bit of a tidy up on it down this other end, and I thought, well, given that I've got this good one, I'll throw that in there. So I've got this whole section of the top of the pillar that I don't need, so I'm just working that off. But it's interesting because this was assembled in several goes. So we've got the pillar on the car, this piece has been welded to it at some point, this piece has been welded to it at some point, and then the roof skin's been put over the top, and then they've welded through the whole lot. So we've got spot welds, and there's a series of really big ones that came around here on the end there, and that's just where they've welded this heavy patch of the top of the pillar to the frame underneath it. And they've got there with a really big welder, a lot of current, and put a really solid weld into it. And then we've got a sequence of smaller ones that come around the edge here. There could be one even hiding in there, I think, where the roof skin was welded through it. But because the electric current has passed through all three layers of metal, they are actually also holding this panel onto the one behind it, which I want to salvage. So I've just been working my way down, and normally I don't worry about a spot weld drill or anything like that. I just use an 8mm or a 5/16 somewhere, there it is, 5/16 drill bit, and I just drill through with that. And that'll just leave a little divot in the metal underneath if you get it to the right depth, and that's easily filled with weld and smoothed off afterwards if you're going to put a different panel on it. Or if you're putting the same pieces back together, that little divot will allow you to realign the original welds, and then when you fill it with weld, it's all ground off, the whole lot seals up and welds together anyway. Now with these really big ones, I had to switch out to a 3/8 drill bit, and 10mm would be the equivalent metric size, to actually cover the whole of the weld. Now there'll be places where I haven't quite cut through, so I'm going to have to come back with my chisel and just work those, and some of those I might have to grind with a die grinder, or have to just go back with the drill bit and open them up a little bit. So we'll get into it and get that off, and then we can show you how it's going to fit on the car. Now this is a gasket scraper that I've just sharpened up to do the job, and it's what I prefer for doing all my spot weld removals with, because it's just so thin. When you look at the edge profile, it'll slide between sections of metal, and I can split them up without actually opening up to a big degree and stretching all the metal around it. But this is waste. I'm not going to use that at all. I could actually even just cut that around there with the angle grinder and get rid of it and grind these away, but we'll see how we go. It'll come to bits. And there's another little weld hiding in there, and I can tell that because the metal's just pulling down to a point now that I've worked each side of it. So I'll get in there with the drill and I'll just loosen that up a little bit. And the idea is just cut through the top layer of metal and it should just pop apart. Just like that. So that one's a perfect one because I've drilled that through and I haven't even had the chisel near it, but you can see it's opened up. Same with that little one there and the one there. The one at the top could still be holding on a bit, but I've also got
this section here, which I don't think I'm going to use any of that, the piece behind it included, but I've cut through here with the angle grinder, so if we split this one in here, we should be able to get this top section to just about lift out. Sometimes it's quite awkward to actually hold some of these shapes in a vise, and you've got to be a bit careful because there's a bit of an arc to the top here. We don't want to be crushing any of that we want to actually salvage and use in our car. So it can get tricky. And that's free. Now there's also an inside liner in there as well that will be hindering us. So I might get the angle grinder and just split this down here, get the bulk of what we don't want out the way, and then we can work out what we're going to do with it. The inside piece is the one that's holding us. It's going to be tricky to cut. Just have a go at this. Nearly there. So this is the piece I'm trying to salvage. So I want this bracket. I've still got a bit of material to get off there, which will be easy. There's only 2 spot welds on there. But I'm not going to use that. That's the inside pillar in the car. I'm going to put a cut through here somewhere. Now it is legal to actually weld these pillars. We can put a join in it, that's no worries, but we can't actually run a join all the way through the whole pillar with the outside material, because you wind up with just a weld holding the roof on there. In an accident that can tear off. So if you're going to actually change parts like this and you're going to do the whole lot, make sure you stagger it and put the outside cut in a different spot to the inside one, drill all the spot welds, open them up, and make this dog leg join across the whole thing to make it super strong. But in our case, none of this outside material is being changed. That's all the same as what the factory put in the car, and we'll just put a nice butt weld in here, all easy to do, easy to get to, and we'll clean all that up and it'll be just like it was never there. So that's all good. So I'll get this piece off here. I don't want that bit, and I don't want that bit, and then we can get that prepped and ready to go in the car. So that's actually going to be a nice piece. Happy with that. I'll just prep this to blast because I'm going to sandblast and prime all this before it goes together. So I'll work this edge along here and I'll make it all nice and straight again. And I've still got some bits of metal left in a few places. I can grind them off. And I've also got some of these little divots because I'm not putting the same roof panel back onto it. These holes are going to be in different spots. So I'll fill all these with weld and grind them smooth, and it'll be back to being an as new piece of material again. There's a little factory pressing in there. It actually steps in a bit to go behind the other piece of material. So I've just ground the weld back to that, roughly that line there. So when we go together, even though this is a second-hand part going into an existing car, we will be able to wriggle that into place and get it to line up, and then I can put a MIG weld across that, and it's back to being as the factory had it. So no one but us guys will know anything about it. I do also have a little concern. This is quite scaly rusty in here, and there's a lap join here where this corner's joined onto the centre section, and I'm thinking that given that this car's going to be done up quite nicely and I've put a lot of effort into it, I'm going to separate that now, and that way I can sandblast this part as individual parts, bit of weld through primer, weld it back together again, and then I know in my own mind that I'm going to be free from rust up there. Now, looking at the life of a car when you do it up, and you say if you got 30 years out of it you might have been happy, you could argue that this is going to last that long, but there's another thing to consider. This is the inside of the roof rail, and the headlining actually sits right up against it. So we could actually have a little rust bleed where the rust stain wants to weep out and stain the inside of our headliner, and that might only be happening in a few years from when we do the car up. So it's well worthwhile to actually chase some of these seams if you are suspicious of having a bit of rust already growing in there. We'll get it apart, we can blast it, prime it, put it all back together, and then we'll know for sure that it's going to be good for a long, long time. That one's off. Now spot welds don't like to be moved or rocked. So I've just prized up that corner there, and we've got all this area here free, so we should be able to just about, it's going to rock now, so once we do that, the metal will fatigue and break very quickly. There we go. So that's separated it, and as I suspected, there's rust in here. So you can see it's only surface rust, it's only mild, but left untreated, a bit of condensation inside the roof and sort of creeping around if the car's out in the weather at any point in time, and that'll grow. So particularly these areas like this. So what I'll do, beat all this back into submission, give it a bit of a grind up, and then both these pieces are ready to go out for blast and prime. I'm getting ready to take this piece out of the car, and I would always prefer to over brace something rather than under brace something. Now this is a pretty straightforward piece, and these cars are pretty solid here, so we could actually just measure the gap between this piece and the one on the other side and make sure when we put it back together that if it had moved we could spread it back out and clamp it and then weld it, and that'd work just as well. But for the little bit of time it takes to actually just cut a piece of metal, and this time I just used 2 offcuts that were laying around in my scrap pile, weld them into the car. It really doesn't take that much time, and we know for sure then that when we go back together it will be exactly the same dimension as it used to be. Now I've also spent a lot of my life working by myself, so I come up with these little ways of holding things, and today I've just clamped the vice grips to the pillar underneath where I wanted to sit the piece of square tube, sat it on top of the 2 vice grips. I can weld one side, walk around the other side, weld it, and it's all good, it all stays there. So that's handy when you're at home by yourself in the shed. Now the other thing, I've still got the steering column in this car, I've got the gear shift in it, and these are the sort of things that could attract sparks, and the plastic jacket on the steering column could be damaged. The nickel finish on the gear shift could also have a problem, so what I'm going to do is just throw a welding blanket over it. If you don't have one in your little restoration kit, I highly recommend them. Throw them in there, weld around things, and there's no danger of actually damaging anything from the sparks and things like that. Also good when you're grinding, and there's nothing in the engine bay that really matters at this point, whether we actually get anything on it and whether we get any grinder sparks or anything like that on it. So we're not going to worry too much about that. So I'll just snot this together and we'll get into it. We can chop it up then. I put a good amount of weld on there because I don't want it to actually snap off or anything while I'm working around it, and so that's pretty solid. I will have to get the cutting wheel and actually cut that off, but because I've gone on the edge of this flange for the windscreen to go into, there's 3 layers of good heavy metal welded together there, and I can just cut straight along the line of the edge of it and grind it to shape, and there's no problems. Well, that's good and solid. It's got it in place, and I've got plenty of room left. A very important thing to remember when you're actually putting braces into a car shell, that you leave yourself enough room to do the job you want to do. So it's no good getting in there and putting a brace right in underneath where we're going to be working. I want enough room that I can leave it there, get this piece out, and I'm going to drive this car out to my sandblasting room, and I'll blast everything and then drive it back again, and this is not going to be in the way of any job I have to do. So I've got the brace welded in, it's nice and solid, it's still a bit hot, so I don't really want to be touching that too much, but this piece can come out now, and as I said before, we could have repaired it. Now it's a bit rotten all the way through here, but it would be no drama to have actually made a little piece and welded into there, but I also had a piece over there before that I've already worked on, and given that I had a better piece, I've opted to replace it. But because this is scrap, it doesn't matter how I get it out. I can destroy it to get it out of the car. So for now, I'm just going to slice it off each side, just inside where the spot welds are, and then we can start attacking that. I can even grind all this away in pieces, and that way I can keep the bottom piece that we're keeping in the car, and that'll become a good solid ledge for the new piece to sit on top, and we can weld that through. So we'll get into it with the grinder, chore it up, and bear in mind that on the other side we're going to replace this bottom panel anyway, so it can be chopped out as well. So no drilling really, I'll just get into it and grind it up, and we'll make it happy, hopefully. I've cut it most of the way through, but I didn't let it cut through in one go, because if this panel drops down and bites that disc while I'm squatted down in the car, I could lose control of the angle grinder and injure myself. So I've left that little piece on there, and I can snip that from the top with the grinder, or I could cut it with a pair of tin snips, or just wriggle it off, whatever I want to do. But it's always one of these things. Be wary of what you're doing, because if this panel drops and twists on an angle, that cutting disc is going to bite in that corner and it's going to throw the grinder back in your face, and we don't want that. What I've done is I've cut away all of the remaining material that was in the way. This side was pretty easy, cut back. The other side I cut it away so that I could put this piece in the corner, and I've done an angle cut on there. I much prefer an angle cut to a straight across cut. You get a longer line on the weld, a bit more strength in your weld, and in this case it actually lines up easier. It'll be easier to finish it and grind it. So what we'll do is we'll just grab a little close up looking inside from there. So we've got the angle cut through here, and that matches the piece that fits in the top. So that'll go in and line up. Now, when you start cutting pieces from one car and fitting them in another car, you'll often find that you have a little bit of a mismatch, and this is the case on this one. Now we know, because we took this piece from a Kingswood sedan with a different windscreen, this was pressed on different tooling to what this pillar here was. So we've got a little bit more bulge in the top than what we do in the original parent car. So that's going to be easy enough to correct, because what I'll do is I will weld the pieces that match. So it'll be this area here where the pinch weld goes on it, this area here where it comes up to the windscreen seal, and I can actually weld across the front of the pillar in there, and then I can get my planishing hammer and I can actually shrink this area down until it flows in and matches with this original piece of pillar. Now this will be a no-fill repair. I'll get that nice and smooth, I'll weld it across there, I'll grind it off, and the only thing I'll put on that will just be paint, and that'll come up nice. So that's got that piece up there. It needs, once it's all blasted, weld through primer. I can weld it in around these original lines here, and then I can refit the original crossbar in there. So we'll get it out to the blasting shed and get it set up, and we'll start blasting all this, ready to put the weld through primer on. Now this is my special filter pot to give me nice clean air to breathe, and this yellow hose is my breathing hose for my blasting helmet, and the other hose runs through to the blaster. This is all used garnet, and I use it a few times through, and once we get that sweet spot where it powders up nice, it's really good for doing car panels. So I tend to have 44-gallon drums of it at different rates of use depending on what I want to blast. So the stuff that's been through a lot of time and it's powdered up a lot, it's really good for blasting alloy wheels because it won't rip into the aluminium. And find a bit of new and a bit of old is perfect for doing big areas like quarter panels and roof skins and things like that. So you sort of got to manage the garnet a little bit. I'm blasting it around about 85 pound per square inch, and with a 3/16 or a 4mm-ish nozzle, and that works very well for what I do. Now we've all heard horror stories, and a lot of us have experienced the horror of badly blasted cars, but done right, it really is the best way to remove rust and paint that I know of anyway. Now that pot full will last around about half an hour. So we'll get a lot of it blasted in that time. So that's full. So time to crawl into the suit and get into it. I'll just throw something over the engine and the steering column so I don't blast them, and it'll all be good to go. Okay, time to suit up. I'm just working on a bit of nitpicking around here. I've blasted all this and primed it, and it's just a basic weld through primer. I only use a cold galvanised paint and I thin it with gun wash thinners. It is great for doing all your inside seams and things like that. It has got good corrosion resistance. It would be perfectly fine to leave it here in the tops of all these roof rails and it would prevent rust, but it's not an automotive paint, and automotive paint has some issues going over it. So what my plan is, we'll get all this repaired up and we'll get all the seams welded together that we have to put together. And then the areas where the turret skin's going to go back onto it, like across here, down the sides and across the back window area, I'm going to mask off with the cold galv on there, and then we'll take it back out and we'll just give this a quick blast because all this stuff will come off very easily. I can then prime this and paint this with an automotive paint all the way through here, and that'll make this car last for decades, because when it was new, it was only bare steel. So what I'll get into is I'll get these panels off on this side, I'll get the door out the way and make it a bit easier to get in and out, and it'll also make it easier for our cameras. But I'll show you what I'm working on. Now this is what I've been doing. Where I've drilled this panel apart, and remember this is the corner that came from our salvage piece of roof, so it was never on this car. I've sacrificed all the pieces of metal that were overlapped here and here, but I've drilled the spot welds. So the point of the drill has come through and left a little divot in this piece of metal. Now because this wasn't from this car and the holes aren't going to automatically line up again, and if that was the case I could just weld through, fill this piece of metal, fill the piece of metal on top of it and make a nice solid bond. I didn't want these little divots left in places where the weld wasn't going to be. Now naturally, and being a collector car, it's probably not going to spend much time outside in the rain, but if it was and we wound up with a bit of condensation in the roof, the moisture could seep in between these layers of metal and sit in one of those little drill divots and create a rust spot which will start growing in the roof of the car. So having filled them and smoothed them, I'll weld through prime all of these areas that I've done, and then we can clamp it all together, we can drill through the top piece of metal, get a nice clean area through the paint on the bottom piece, and we can plug it with weld, and that makes a permanent bond. The other thing I've gone ahead and done is, because I'm changing the windscreen from the original square corner type that was used in Utes to the round corner type used in the Kingswood sedans, I've added a piece of metal in this corner here. Now this piece came out of a Kingswood sedan, so it's already got that nice radius corner instead of the cut out square corner, and I've put a bigger piece of metal in than what I need. because if I cut this down to the small size needed, I would have trouble welding it in there. It'd be wanting to burn away and melt as I'm putting the weld in there. So I've left it much larger than what I needed, and once I get this piece positioned underneath it, I can mark the back of it, remove this piece and just grind it to the right shape, or cut it with a pair of snips to the right shape, and then when it goes together for the final time, it'll line up. We'll have the right shape in the corner for our new windscreen to go in. On the other side, because I'm not actually taking it apart, I'll have to use two pieces of metal and weld one in the bottom to effectively the opposite side, one of these, and one in the top, and then weld those together to finish it. So that's yet to come. And the big advantage I have on this side is, this is the factory shape, so I've got a pattern to work from here, but on the other side I don't. So I'll make a little cardboard template or a little metal template off this side, reverse it for the other side, and I can mark out what I need to do that. So that's easy as well. So I'll get a couple of panels out the way and then we'll get into what I've been doing. If you're doing doors by yourself, the easy way to get another pair of hands is to just latch the door shut on the first click, and that way the other end of the door is going to be held in place and you've only got to work on the end with the hinges. This area along here is where I've cut this piece of roof skin along here. This is the frame for the gutter underneath here on the front portion, and the edge of the cutting wheel has just dragged along this piece of metal here, but the further forward it got, because it curls out a little bit, it's cut into it. So I've just run a bead of weld along the top of that, and what I'll do is I'll grind that smooth. The other thing I've done in here is the cutting wheel's actually cut into this piece of metal as I was cutting through the roof skin, and it's just touched it. It's put a little line in there, but because this is a pretty critical part of the car, you don't know what vibrations and things could wind up being a crack in the future. So same thing, I've run a pass of weld across that, and there's another little nick down there that I've yet to weld up, and same thing, I'll grind that off there. So this is the nitpicking stage. We're going to go around and make all the metal perfect, and then we're ready to put the roof back on. Looking along the back here, this was the area where we had the rust coming through the roof. Now this pitted area in the middle, that's actually still fine. That's got enough structural strength in there for this area of the car. But what I will do is weld up these holes. So it's thin from just behind this first hole up to about here. So I'll run a pass of weld through here. I'll probably do one pass on the corner and put two little passes beside it, and then I can grind it back to the same shape. And the same thing up here. I'll just do an area of weld that'll start back here, come forward to here. And like when you're welding across a panel where you're going to weld between the tacks, I'll do one pass, let it cool down a bit, do one beside it and get another one, and we'll work our way through that. You can see from around here we've got the same issue where I've just nicked it with the cutting wheel. It's not all the way through the metal, but the same thing is we don't know if it's going to cause a crack and be a structural issue in the future. Big important thing when we're working on these cars is always consider what would happen if this car was in a massive accident. Now, we do drive them on the road, we like our collector cars to be out and about, but bad things do happen, and these cars are often involved in accidents. So if you're doing any sort of repair or modification to a car, it must be at least as strong as what the factory built the car in the first place. So that's why I'm going over and tidying up all these little spots. This whole piece of roof across the back here, and it's the top of the box section where it comes down and comes to where the back window seal would go on. So this forms the actual little lip that the rubber seal hooks onto, and when the roof skin is back on it, we have got a piece similar to this where the rubber tucks into it. Now, over the time that this car has lived, rust has happened around the window, it's allowed moisture in there, and the moisture sat in this little corner all the way across, and it's pitted it all the way across the car. Now, 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. I could have left it in there. I blasted it when I had the roof skin still on and I was repairing the back portion of that, and I put some weld in a few holes that came along, and at that point in time I was happy enough with that. I've taken the roof off, I've had a better view of it, and there's some spots that got really quite deep pitting in them that I don't like, but the final clincher was when I blasted up underneath here, there's actually a series of little pine rust holes that have come through this bottom panel in here. So I've decided, well, I've got a bit of rust in there. I don't know what's in the middle of this box section. So what we'll do is we'll make a new piece for the back. We'll drill these spot welds across here, and we'll split it just inside the top corner there, and we'll weld a whole new piece across the back. And while we've got this off,
I can actually look at the inner panel, I can give that a nice blast and clean that up, and any portions in there that actually are rusty or got holes through them, we can cut those pieces out and replace them. Now, it's a very solid sounding panel. There's no scaly rust sitting up there, and so I'm not expecting any great dramas other than where this little patch is here in the corner. So, but we'll find out once we get it opened up. So I'll start working my way around the car, getting these areas tidied up, and then we'll get that front roof rail in, and then we'll move back here and hop into the back of it. By priming that up now, I can actually have that curing while I'm actually repairing one of the other areas. So always just sort of work like that. If you can sort of plan what you want to do, you can achieve a lot in a short period of time. And two things are happening at once now. Always good. Just dialing in my plate thickness, which is 1.2 millimetres. And this welder will be ready to rock and roll. And I will go back to 56 is my favourite for doing this size metal. Just going to weld these little pinholes up along here. Now, as I've said before many times, don't be in a hurry with your welding. If you want to do good work and have minimal shrinkage, weld a bit, let it cool, weld a bit more, let it cool. Now, it doesn't matter what you do, every weld is going to shrink to a degree. So if we can have the shrinkage compensated by the strength in the steel, we won't have distortion. If we build the heat and the size of the weld up to a point where we're going to have a massive amount of shrinkage, no amount of strength that this steel has got is going to stop it from distorting. So if I sat there and just welded this whole area up in here, I would create distortion down here. We would actually wind up with a ripple pulling into this point in the roof, and we've already got a little bit of a style line on the car that fades just in here. So when I run my hand across it, there is a little bit of a dip as it goes through where this chrome moulding fits on. So that's already a crease, and if there's a panel like that, that is the area where it wants to actually pull and change. So little bit by little bit, we'll build it up and then we'll grind it off and it'll be back to as good as new. No, we're too hot, we've got too much current, so I'm going to go down on my plate size, and I'm just eating holes through this thin stuff. So we'll just adjust the welder. Straight away I can actually run a weld now instead of just trying to zap, zap, zap to chase holes. So I'll do a little pass across the bottom and then I'll work to the back, and I've also got an angle grinder cut on the back here to weld. So I've got 3 locations, so I can work this one, work this one, work this one, and then a little bit of time in between we'll be able to get back on and do the same sequence again. Now, my general rule of thumb, if I can hold my hand on it, it's cool enough to go back and do the second pass. Another rough rule of thumb, if you can get a continual pass of weld across your pitted area, that's strong enough to leave in there. There's enough material left there, the rust isn't to that stage, that it's caused an issue for the car. So I always try and work on the fact that if I can just go zzz and get a nice continual pass, and I'm not eating holes around that, that metal's good enough to put back into a vehicle. So that's coming down now, the heat's disappearing out into the rail around it. Don't be afraid of having a bit of heat in your repair. That's not really a killer. A little bit of heat actually preheats the area and they weld quite well. It's just that piling more and more back in there, we're just going to create bigger and bigger shrinkage. Still wants a little while. Like I say, doesn't pay to be in a hurry. So, right, I can hold my hand there now. That's how quick it runs away. So that's real time, just a few minutes and you're all done. You can put another pass on. Alright, that was actually running into some of the worst material here. So there was actually rust holes already there and thin metal. So I was just pulsing my weld to keep it a little bit cooler to get it across that area. And I've got a hole at the back, another rust hole above it, and I've got a really thin area at the front above it. So I'd say we're going to have 2 or 3 more little passes in this area. Some of them will have to pulse, but the outside edge one for sure will be back to good metal. We can do a nice bead across that, and that'll get that one sealed up. This piece in here is back to, I can hold my hand there quite comfortably. It's hot, but it's not burning my hand. So I can get another pass in there. Same thing with this one. We're moving up into the worst of it now. So there'll be a bit of pulsing going on, a bit of welding, and we'll work past that, and that's probably going to want another couple of passes as well. Rusty Holden Utes. One day it'll be nice. So I've got enough material now on this little angle grinder cut at the back. That's welded all the way across, so that bit's done. I've still got this little rotten patch up the top here. Another couple of passes there. I've still got a hole on the front one that I'll plug this time round, and then we'll put a pass beside that. This little back corner's one where we could have actually cut it out and put a little piece in it. But I've come from a background of restoring other people's cars and selling my time. So in these situations, it's always a case of look at what is the quickest and cheapest way to meet the repair. Now, I still believe, and I'll still maintain, that this is still the quickest way to make this repair. But if you find that you are having trouble doing a small repair like this because your welding skills are causing you to blow holes through the surrounding material, it can sometimes be quicker for you to fold a little piece of metal, and it can just be bent in the vise or over the corner of a bench and cut out on this edge, and a bit of weld down each side, and you're not trying to weld into thin material, you're actually trying to weld into good material, and that's a little bit easier. But for us today, the biggest time consumer now is just waiting for it to cool down. So we had a few minutes there, we'd pumped a bit of heat into the panel from a couple of passes, and so I left that cool down. But this one here, that's cooled down already, I can get onto that and weld that, and this one's not far behind it. So this time around I'm just going to plug my last remaining hole, and then we'll do a few little spots in this one up here, and then we're nearly ready to do a final pass on the front one, and I'd say there's going to be another 2 good passes on the back one to get it filled in. So here's our welds along the top here. That one's pretty good. I've worked the back corner, got a bit of weld in there, and that's all into pretty good solid metal. So I can grind this one and grind the back one off there, and that'll come back to being nice and smooth. And here's the little hole that I've blown on the front piece of weld. So that was a little bit more rotten than I thought, and there's a little sequence of rust pits that almost form a line there, so I'm going to weld them up as well, and that'll make that solid. Now, because this is up inside the roof, you don't really need to grind it. I like to, simply because it's that whole condensation and moisture thing. If we get a bit of moisture runs down from inside the turret, winds up on this piece of metal in here,
and it wants to just sit in the crease beside our weld, it's actually going to cause us a problem. If we accidentally leave this a little bit too proud, we put our turret back on, and because this is in a little welding recess, we might sit it in there, it's touching on that, so we tap the piece in there, weld it on, and it's all good. With the movement of the car, we can wind up with a squeak where this piece of metal's actually pinching and rubbing on the skin. So I like to take no chances. I leave everything nice and clean and smooth and back to the shape the factory had it. Now, here's a really interesting thing. If we look at this panel here where it's been welded onto the car, there's a sequence of spot welds in here, and it was like this from factory. It was sitting high on the back, but on the other side of the car, there's a MIG weld wraps around here and a MIG weld that wraps around here. Now these were overlooked at the factory. So whether the guy on this side of the car while it was being welded together was rolling a new cigarette or something like that, or turning around and talking to one of his mates in the other line, and this car actually just sort of crept past him and it didn't get done, and the inspector didn't notice and the roof just got dropped on over the top, we'll never know. But it's interesting, you do find these cars, and often these cars will have a sneaky little squeak in them somewhere. You're driving down a gravel road or something like this and there's an annoying little squeak somewhere in the car, and usually it's because one of these welds has been overlooked at the factory. So grab a picture on this and we'll have a look at the other side. So this side has got a nice big weld in around the corner there, just holding that corner of the panel down, and the same at the front. So we'll do now what the factory didn't do 50 years ago. Und now we wait again. In our next episode, we'll get this corner piece in here finished off, and we'll get this roof rail put back into the car and have that all finished off. We'll nitpick a lot of these weld sections along here so that when the turret goes back on it repaired for the final time, we can just weld through here and get that finalised. And then we'll be moving on to this back box section and we'll make up a whole new piece for the back of that and get that welded in place. I'm Rob Teal. Thank you very much for watching.